On the night of August 21st, 1791, a storm rolled in over the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, and by morning, the richest sugar colony on earth was burning. Cap Français choked on smoke. Cane fields, orange and roaring, threw light onto a sky already lit by lightning. This single colony grew nearly 40% of the sugar reaching Europe's tables. Within weeks, close to 4,000 of its white colonists were dead, and the plantations that fed a continent's sweet tooth lay in ash. Centuries earlier, when Crusaders first tasted this crop in the deserts of the Holy Land, they gave it a name that made no sense on its own. They called it sweet salt. They meant it as a compliment. They had no idea how literal it would become. Because this fire, this fortune, this fear, none of it started here. It started nearly 8,000 years earlier, in a garden nobody would think to look for it. Long before sugar was worth anything, it was just grass. Somewhere in the highlands of New Guinea, around 6,000 years before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, Papuan farmers began doing something patient and unglamorous with a wild, fibrous reed called Saccharum robustum. They selected the stalks that ran sweetest, saved their cuttings, planted them again. Generation after generation, they bred a taller, juicier cousin of that wild cane, one botanist now called Saccharum officinarum. Nobody was chasing an empire. They were feeding pigs. Picture the plant in that first form. A thick green stalk, tough as a broom handle, no crystal, no powder, nothing you would recognize on a shelf today. To get anything sweet out of it at all, you had to cut it, peel back the fibrous rind with your teeth or a blade, and chew. The juice that came out was thin, warm, and grassy, more like sugarcane water than dessert. Still, it was sweeter than almost anything else available on that island, and that was enough. It became a garden crop, then a trade good, carried by Austronesian sailors as they pushed east into the Pacific and west toward the mainland of Asia. By around 500 years before the Common Era, the plant had reached India, carried along the same sea lanes and river routes that moved rice and spice. India's climate turned out to be extraordinary for cane, and Indian farmers scaled it in a way New Guinea never had reason to. Sanskrit texts from this era mention it directly. The word they used, sarkara, meant something close to gravel or pebble grit, a nod to the grainy texture of the raw sugar they were pressing out. It is the root of nearly every word for sugar spoken today, sarkara becoming al-sukar in Arabic, then sucre, zucchero, and sugar. For centuries, sugar in India still meant a syrup or a paste, sticky and perishable, useless for long-distance trade. Then, sometime around the middle of the 4th century, Indian chemists solved the one problem that had kept sugar local: how to pull the water out and leave behind something solid, boiling the juice down, cooling it, letting it crystallize into small, hard, transportable grains. For the first time, sugar could survive a journey. It could sit in a jar for months. It could be weighed, taxed, sold, and shipped. The difference between a garden treat and a global commodity. That single technical leap, made by people whose names did not survive in the record, is the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. A pig feed had become a portable, storable, valuable substance. And valuable substances throughout history attract attention from people who did not grow them. The crystals moved west along trade routes that were already carrying pepper, silk, and stories. In the year 642 of the Common Era, Arab armies conquered Persia and found sugarcane already growing there, along with the Indian knowledge of how to crystallize it. Over the following century, as the reach of the Arab world extended across North Africa and into Spain, sugarcane cultivation and refining techniques traveled with it. Farmers planted it in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Sicily, in Cyprus, wherever there was enough water and enough sun. Scholars and physicians in these regions folded sugar into medicine as much as food, prescribing it for fevers, for coughs, for weakness, treating it less like a treat and more like a remedy worth its price. Europe, meanwhile, had almost no idea sugar existed. Then came the Crusades. Beginning near the end of the 11th century, European soldiers and pilgrims marched into the Holy Land and encountered something they had never tasted, a sweet reed sold in markets and praised by locals. One Crusader chronicler described a plant whose juice was gathered like honey and claimed it was sweeter than anything a bee could produce. Soldiers carried the taste home in memory long before anyone carried the plant itself. Sugar was recorded in England for the first time in 1099. It arrived as an oddity, a story from the East, and only slowly as an actual good on English shelves. For the next several centuries, sugar stayed almost unimaginably expensive. In London in the year 1319, a pound of sugar cost 2 shillings, a price that would translate to something near $100 American for a single kilogram in today's money. At that price, sugar was not a pantry staple. It was a luxury alongside gold thread and imported silk, locked in cabinets, doled out by the spoonful. Royal kitchens built entire sculptures out of it, castles and animals and coats of arms carved from hardened sugar paste and set on banquet tables purely to announce how much wealth the host commanded. Physicians still sold it by the ounce as medicine. Merchants in Venice built fortunes simply moving it from eastern ports to European nobility, and the city grew into one of the wealthiest trading powers in the world, partly on the back of a plant most Europeans had never seen growing. By the late 1400s, that appetite had outgrown everything the Eastern Mediterranean could reliably supply. Portugal and Spain had already begun planting cane on their Atlantic island colonies, Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé, testing whether the crop could thrive somewhere closer to home. It could. And in 1493, on his second voyage, a Genoese explorer named Christopher Columbus carried cane cuttings from the Canary Islands across the ocean to the island of Hispaniola. Nobody watching him load those cuttings onto the ship understood what they were setting in motion. An entire hemisphere was about to be reorganized around a grass. Sugarcane itself was never the problem. Nobody who tasted it needed convincing. The barrier this crop had to survive was not taste or fear or superstition. It was labor, brutal and relentless, on a scale nothing in Europe had ever organized for a food crop before. Growing cane is one thing. Processing it fast enough to matter is another. Cut cane starts losing its sugar within about a day, which meant planting, harvesting, and boiling all had to happen on an unforgiving clock in tropical heat, with round-the-clock millwork during harvest season. European colonizers first tried to solve this with the indigenous populations of the Caribbean. Disease and brutal treatment collapsed those populations within a few short decades. The labor problem did not go away. It got worse. The Portuguese had already found their answer before Columbus ever sailed. On the island of São Tomé, off the African coast, by the 1530s, Portuguese planters were running sugar estates worked entirely by enslaved Africans. It was a small, brutal proof of concept. Spanish colonizers copied it in Cuba within the following decade. Then, in the 1640s, an English planter named James Drax applied the same model on the small Caribbean island of Barbados, and something changed. Sugar prices were still sky high. Profits were enormous. Other planters rushed to copy him. Historians call what followed the Sugar Revolution small family farms bought up, cleared, and converted into plantations within a generation. None of these colonial powers coordinated with each other. Portugal, Spain, and England each landed on the identical brutal solution, independently, separated by decades and by oceans, because the economics pointed the same direction every time. That convergence tells you something. It was not one villain's idea. It was a system finding its cruelest, most efficient point again and again, wherever the same crop and the same profits appeared. By 1661, the profits flowing out of Barbados were large enough that colonial lawmakers wrote something new into existence: the first formal slave codes in the English Caribbean, laws that defined enslaved human beings as property, alongside land and livestock. Other colonies copied the codes the same way they had copied the plantations. The model spread. It scaled. By the 1780s, on the French half of the island of Hispaniola, in a colony called Saint-Domingue, it reached its absolute peak, nearly 800 sugar plantations, a population of enslaved people numbering in the hundreds of thousands, controlled by a white population a fraction of that size. One French nobleman warned his countrymen that they were sleeping at the foot of a volcano. Almost nobody listened. On the night of August 14, 1791, in a wooded area called Bois Cayman, enslaved people from plantations across the northern plain gathered in secret. A Vodou priest named Dutty Boukman led the ceremony. A priestess, Cecile Fatiman, stood beside him. Accounts describe an animal sacrificed, its blood shared among those present, a binding ritual before what came next. Word passed from plantation to plantation in the days that followed, quiet, urgent, unstoppable. Then, on the night of August 21st, a tropical storm broke over the plain. Thunder, lightning splitting the dark. To the men and women gathered that night, the storm did not read as bad luck. It read as a sign. They rose. What followed has been described by historians in blunt numbers. Within the next 2 months, close to 100,000 enslaved people had joined the uprising across the northern province. They burned or destroyed roughly 180 sugar plantations. They destroyed hundreds more coffee and indigo estates. Somewhere near 4,000 white colonists were killed. News reached Paris within weeks, and one French newspaper reported, starkly, that 200 plantations were on fire and 300 whites already dead, a number that kept climbing as more reports arrived. White colonists organized militias and struck back, killing an estimated 15,000 black Haitians in the weeks that followed. This was not the end. It was the opening scene of 13 years of war. The colony's free population of color joined the fighting. A formerly enslaved man named Toussaint Louverture rose to command the rebellion's forces, defeating French, then British, then Spanish attempts to retake the island. Napoleon sent an army in 1802 to crush the rebellion once and for all. Yellow fever did what French muskets could not. More than half of that army died of disease within months. By 1804, it was over. The colony that had produced nearly 40% of Europe's sugar declared itself an independent nation and took the name Haiti. The human cost by the time the fighting stopped was staggering. Something near 100,000 of the roughly 500,000 enslaved people on the island had died, along with 24,000 of the colony's 40,000 white residents. The economic cost was just as absolute. Before the revolution, the colony had exported close to 100 million pounds of sugar a year. By 1820, that number was practically nothing. The single richest sugar colony in human history had ceased to exist as a sugar colony at all. For the first and only time in the story of the Americas, an enslaved population had risen up, fought a colonial power to a standstill, and won. The plantations were ash. The fields that had made European fortunes for a century sat unplanted, and an entire hemisphere's sugar supply had just lost its largest single source, overnight. The world's sweet tooth did not disappear just because Saint-Domingue had. It simply went looking for its sugar somewhere else. Cuba was ready. Spanish colonizers had been growing cane there since the 1500s, and in the decades after Haiti's revolution, Cuban planters expanded aggressively to fill the gap. Roughly 800,000 enslaved Africans were eventually transported to Cuba, working 16-hour days in cane fields that grew hotter and more industrial by the decade. As steam-powered mills replaced the older technology, Cuba became the Caribbean's new sugar giant almost by default, inheriting a crown nobody had wanted to hand over, but everybody still wanted filled. Back in Europe, the appetite kept climbing regardless of where the sugar came from. In Britain, per-person sugar consumption had sat at roughly £4 a year at the start of the 1700s. By 1800, it had reached £18, more than a fourfold increase across the century. Tea did most of that work. What had once been a nobleman's ritual, sipped with sugar dissolved carefully into fine porcelain, became a working-class habit. Sweetened tea taken on a factory floor during a short break, sugar stirred into a cup by a laborer's wife who, a century earlier, would never have touched the stuff. The sugar in that cup and the enslaved hands that had cut the cane behind it were separated by an entire ocean neither side would ever see across. Not everyone was comfortable depending so completely on cane grown this way. In 1747, a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf demonstrated something quietly enormous. The sweet crystals extracted from beet juice were chemically identical to the sugar pulled from cane. At the time, it barely registered as news. Decades later, when European wars cut off cane imports, that discovery would matter enormously, giving the continent an alternative source that had nothing to do with a Caribbean plantation at all. But cane never lost its dominance. It scaled, industrialized, and spread further, from the Caribbean into Louisiana, into Brazil, into new colonies across the world, until sugar stopped being a luxury anywhere and became something closer to a given, present in nearly everything people ate or drank, whether they thought about where it came from or not. Today, the plant a Papuan farmer once bred to feed pigs produces something close to 186 million metric tons of sugar worldwide every single year. Brazil alone grows over 700 million tons of raw cane annually, more than the rest of the planet combined. Sugar sits inside nearly every processed food on every grocery shelf on Earth, so ordinary now that it barely registers as a commodity at all. Here is the part almost nobody predicts. Mixed with a common oxidizer called potassium nitrate, ordinary table sugar burns fast enough and hot enough to launch a rocket. Amateur rocketeers have known this since the 1940s, and they call the resulting solid fuel rocket candy. It is cheap, it is legal to make, and hobbyists have been perfecting it in garages and backyards for decades. One group took that idea about as far as it can go. A volunteer program called Sugar Shot to Space has spent years trying to do exactly what its name promises: fly a rocket, fueled entirely by sugar, to the internationally recognized edge of space, 100 kilometers up. On November 17, 2013, team member Phil Vukovic set the amateur altitude record for a sugar-powered rocket, sending one roughly 12.4 kilometers into the sky on nothing but table sugar and an oxidizer. Nobody has reached space on sugar yet, but the attempt itself is the twist worth sitting with. A grass first domesticated to feed livestock, first chewed raw by hand for a thin, sweet trickle of juice, is now, in a very literal sense, trying to leave the atmosphere. Set its beginning and its present moment side by side, and they barely look like the same story. Pig feed on one end, rocket fuel on the other, with an entire hemisphere reorganized by force somewhere in between. Trace the whole shape of it, start to finish. A wild grass bred patiently by Papuan farmers who wanted nothing more than better feed for their pigs. A crystallization discovery in India that turned a garden treat into a tradable good. A slow crawl west through the Islamic world and into Crusader memory, arriving in Europe as a rumor before it arrived as a substance. Centuries as a locked cabinet luxury, weighed by the spoonful, carved into sculptures for kings. Then, the ocean crossing, the labor problem no one wanted to solve honestly, and the horrific solution that scaled it into an entire economic system built on human beings treated as property, a colony that grew rich beyond imagination on that system, and then in one storm-lit night in August of 1791, burned to the ground by the very people it had enslaved. An empire's habits rearranged around a cup of tea, a grass that now improbably tries to fly. Go back to that first image, a colony on fire, a fortune turning to ash, 4,000 dead within weeks. It is tempting to read that fire as the tragedy of sugar's story. It was not. It was the one place in this entire arc where the people paying the true cost of that sweetness finally, briefly, made the world pay it back. Long before that fire, someone tasting sugar for the first time reached for the strangest words available to describe it. They called it sweet salt. They meant only that it was too strange, too new to have an ordinary name yet. They could not have known that centuries later, the words would fit for an entirely different reason. Once the sweetness reaching European tables came from fields worked by people who paid for it in exactly that mixture, their own sweat and their own blood. That is the real history hiding inside every spoonful. If any part of this surprised you, the fire, the rocket, the sheer scale of what one grass became, let me know which one in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, the true, strange histories hiding behind the food on your table, subscribe. There is plenty more where this came from.